I was pleased to be able to know that we have Dr. Francis Koti here with us today. I will at least read his title. He's a professor of global studies and human geography at Middle Tennessee State University in Murfreesboro, Tennessee. He's an urban geographer, woohoo! And Dr. Koti holds a PhD in geography from West Virginia University and Morgantown, West Virginia. However, boss's privilege, my boss, upon seeing his name on the list of speakers for our symposium here, let me know that he's actually an old friend. And so Dr. Lee Schwartz wanted to come back and provide a bit of a personal introduction for Dr. Koti here today. How are we doing?
You've got me now.
We've got you now. Oh, hi, Lee.
Just in the nick of time.
Take it away.
Okay. Well, good day, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. We have people from all over the world, so I think I've got all bases covered. And as Laura mentioned, I'm very pleased to have the honor to introduce, excuse me, Dr. Francis Koti as today's keynote speaker, not only because of my respect for his work and his leadership in the field, but also because, as Laura mentioned, I've been friends with Francis ever since we first met, when my office invited him to participate in our Global Dialogues for Emerging Science and Technology Symposium in Cape Town, South Africa, back in 2008. I guess that was when GIS could still be considered an emerging science and technology, and also back when you could have in-person meetings to discuss future applications and collaborations. And the theme of that meeting was geospatial science for sustainable development in Africa. And it was founded on the concept of mapping Africa for Africa. And that is still fundamental to our participatory and inclusive approach to tap into local expertise, to fill in knowledge gaps in mapping the human geography of urban areas around the world today. And you'll soon see that our keynote speaker exemplifies those values. Dr. Koti is Professor of Global Studies and Human Geography at Middle Tennessee State University. He's an urban geographer by training and earned his PhD from West Virginia University. His research revolves around the use of geographic information systems within participatory and methodological frameworks to understand urbanization processes with a regional focus on Africa. Francis has worked in several capacities to promote the inclusion and collaboration of diaspora African scholars and scientists. And I know a few people who have worked harder to make our academic discipline more interactive and participatory. In addition to serving most recently as chair of the Department of Geography at Middle Tennessee State, Francis has previously held administrative and leadership positions as interim associate dean and department chair at the University of North Alabama, secretary of the Southeast Division of the American Association of Geographers, and guest editor of a special edition of the journal Africa Today. I know of no scholar whose research on African cities more effectively straddles the worlds of academic and applied geography, in particular his studies of peri-urban development, urban and regional planning, local community resource use and access, and social and spatial exclusion in African cities. Francis has for years been at the forefront of work related to participatory GIS. He is perfectly suited to provide today's keynote talk on the theme of livelihoods that is so critical to raising the human condition in many of the world's urban communities, where inequities abound and there are stark differences between the served and the underserved. More importantly, however, knowing Francis means you can't help but be impressed by his passion, his concern for humanity, and his desire to understand more about how neighbors and neighborhoods can better sustain themselves, not just in his native Kenya or in Africa, but in underserved communities worldwide, including in the United States. So Francis, welcome to our virtual symposium, and I thank you in advance for sharing some pearls of your wisdom with us today. I'm sure we will enjoy what you have to say. Over to you. It's good to see you, my friend.
Thank you very much, Lee. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. And allow me first to thank Lee personally for working with me and mentoring me in various ways over the years since 2009 when I met him through today, either through my academic work or my work as an academic leader here in the United States and also back where I come from in Kenya. I also wish to thank organizers of C2M2 Symposium for inviting me to this session. Is really tremendous honor. And particularly, I would like to thank Yuan for corresponding quite effectively and efficiently to make this work in the past few weeks. My talk today is resilience amid uncertainty, COVID-19 pandemic, and the informal sector and livelihoods in African cities. And really, it stems from my interest and passion in understanding place, understanding how we interact with each other, how we interact with the built environment, and how people in what Laura earlier called suburban scale access resources and programs and services. And so what you're going to hear here is not necessarily linked to just the past few years, but to over 20 years of work, looking at how expert and non-expert systems can communicate. And that is where I'm coming from. And so in the next 20 minutes, I will try to frame the informal sector and urban livelihoods within a broader context, and then make some observations on perceived resilience and expansion of the of the informal sector amid COVID-19, and reframe the conversation to try to ask new questions, and then try and see if I can identify some areas where people can collaborate. And since I've been working in Kenya in the past few years, I will use Kenya as an example. Here is a summary of what I think I will try to capture. That post-pandemic informal sector is probably going to look like it's expanding, but it will be more sophisticated than we think. Because one, folks that are falling out of the formal sector are coming into the informal sector with new skills, will introduce new activities, and will probably exacerbate an already differentiated landscape. There is a perceived resilience of and expansion of the informal sector, and there's a chance that could conceal inherent inequalities, and that could create a simultaneous empowerment and marginalization of a section of the informal sector. And one of the observations I'm also making is that the second order impacts will not be experienced the same or in a uniform manner across multiple scales, across social and economic scales. And how to mitigate this is probably going to require a better understanding, and there's no better way to do that than to connect local narratives and data points in order to understand the landscape, and a more integrative approach, more multi-scale, multi-stakeholder approach that recognizes those differences, I think will be critical. Those are the arguments I'll be making here. And when I became interested in this topic, I started looking at what is written in popular press about the informal sector. And much of that seemed to paint a grim picture of what is likely to happen to a sector that potentially employs over 80% of urban populations. And I became concerned because previously I'd been looking at issues of access to water, which is what Gaston mentioned earlier, is what they are working in Nairobi. And so based on surveys of what has been written about the informal sector, I will not bog you down with the literature and theories, but there seems to be a conceptualization that pulls together three related concepts. Something about employment and production in an unregulated and registered small businesses, and informal employment with no social protections, and as we've heard earlier from Robert Richardson, and the informal economy, which has elements of what I just mentioned earlier, 1 and 2. And regardless of what the definitions are or what the conceptualizations are, clearly the informal sector in urban settings is a key economic force. And it embraces quite a diversity in terms of the people, in terms of the activities, and in terms of the character of the sector itself. There's quite a diversity in those which we need to pay attention to when we address the informal sector. But generally speaking, the literature has a tendency to focus on conceptualizations and attempts to recognize and integrate the informal sector into the formal economies. And New Earth looks at the value of the sector itself, while others look at what opportunities exist and what challenges face the informal sector, with others looking at the precariousness of the sector. But that is not the focus of my talk here. But generally, when you look at the attitudes towards this sector, which we already looking at as a major economic force, there seems to be different attitudes from different observers. The public, generally, this is where you go when you cannot find something to do. The government, looking at this from tax evasion, illegal aspect, while planners, which I have a background, looking at how the informal sector creates chaos, and it is unorganized and sometimes undesirable. And so there is a tendency to homogenize conceptualizations of the informal sector. And this is where the second order impacts of COVID-19 will play itself in a much more far-reaching way. And clearly, the informal sector is a major employer, and I cannot overemphasize that. And in the country where I come from, if these statistics are right, 83.5% of total employment just 2 years ago within this sector is quite significant to ignore. So at the advent of the pandemic, most questions revolve around these and more questions: tolerance, recognition and integration, legalization, how precarious it is, and little attention to the enormous value of this sector. And when you look at the government measures during the pandemic to mitigate against impact, the informal sector was not necessarily part of that, and I will mention that briefly. So when you look at the Kenyan experience of the pandemic, clearly most of the measures you see here to contain COVID-19 were quite ambivalent to the practices of the informal sector, whether it is the school closure of public gatherings, which completely removes or deprives the informal sector of key access to business, whether it is enforcing nationwide night curfews or border closures. Most of these were quite unfriendly to the informal sector. But then the key thing here is when you look at these 7 government measures devised to buffer Kenyans against financial hardships, none of this was geared towards the informal sector, whether it is the tax reliefs or reduction in turnover tax rates or reduction in resident income, making available this amount of money, $95 million to vulnerable groups. None of this really specifically targeted the informal sector. And there are arguments that these are not formalized, the informal sector is not formalized. And so when you look at the publications I posted there earlier, really what most observers expected during COVID-19 was that the informal sector would get hit hard, which happened. And the movement and public gathering restrictions would probably decimate vulnerable informal sector players, and many informal sector businesses would close or go away. And so most of these happened, but there's something interesting. Obviously, any economist would have told you there will be a disruption of supply chains, and both supply and demand shocks will hurt the informal sector. And so most of what was written at the time was quite grim. But then really what happened with the wholesale lockdowns and quarantines? More formal businesses closed, affecting a lot of people and creating lots of layoffs. Schools closed for a year. A lot of people lost employment and became underemployed in the private and government sector. And people employed in government sector probably working from the house. Many people within formal sector who lost jobs began to seek relief in the informal sector. So what did not have the social safety net became the place to cushion folks falling out of the formal sector. And I found this interesting, these 2 or 3 headlines: Kenya's labor market not made for the pandemic, and Kenya's informal sector cushioning folks that lost jobs. And that already creates a disconnect between exactly what is happening in the informal sector. And there is a perceived resilience in the informal sector which cannot be overplayed. And this talk is not necessarily about that perceived resilience, even though it is important to highlight why the informal sector looks like it actually went through and opened up from the pandemic successfully. But what does that perceived resilience really mean? Does it imply uniform experiences across social and spatial scales within the informal sector? That is a question that needs an answer. And that is why I'm looking to reframe the conversation to think about what can we learn from the relative or perceived resilience of the informal sector. I think that is a question that we need to ask ourselves, whether that is a real resilience or whether there are internal differences in what we think is a resilient sector. And in what ways will the impacts of COVID-19 pandemic continue to impact or to affect the informal sector as a key source of livelihood in cities? Or in other words, what will the post-COVID-19 informal sector really look like? And what adaptations will be needed in the informal sector to respond to the second order impact, which I think need attention? And how might geospatial technologies, which is something I'm familiar with and I've used for several years now, enhance local community adaptations to the new socio-economic and spatial realities in these spaces? Those are questions I think will need to be discussed as we go forward. And the way I've set my approach here is I used about a year of survey of literature and online resources and blogs, and I was planning to go to Kenya this summer, but we'll go to Kenya in summer 2022, really interested in looking at what is happening in the ground. And I was really, really pleased to listen to Erica and also to listen to Gaston's work and other work going on around the world. What I see happening in real time, however, is that there will be an expansion of the informal sector to include actors who were not previously there. More skilled actors, more educated actors, actors with access to information. Doesn't mean that the old actors will go away. There will be a new set of activities which requires more skill, more knowledge, and which will be more sophisticated. And we are already seeing a shift in attitude toward the informal sector, which is a good thing, especially from government and also from the formal sector. And the one thing I'm really emphasizing here is that the impact, second order impacts of the pandemic will not be uniform. They're going to be greater on much more vulnerable populations, especially populations that are less skilled. This will be new players in the informal sector who were previously in the formal sector, looking at the informal sector as a cushion against losses from previous employment in the formal sector, which leads me to what I'm calling preliminary arguments before really I get to the ground to look at what is happening there. So the key main arguments I'm making is that the post-pandemic informal sector is going to look like it's expanding and is going to look more sophisticated with new activities and new actors from the formal sector. And that perceived resilience and expansion may actually try to conceal inherent disparities. With these disparities could come simultaneous empowerment of those with more skill, with more access to information, with more access to services, more access to programs, and more access to resources. At the same time, that could simultaneously marginalize populations who don't have access to those things. The more, what I'm calling the more vulnerable populations. The pandemic will exacerbate those already existing disparities in the informal sector. And so the second order impact will not be experienced uniformly. They will be much more pronounced, especially among vulnerable populations, what I'm calling different social and spatial scales. And so to mitigate against second order impacts will require really a better understanding of the sector by trying to connect lived experiences, which may be in form of narratives, data points, and the resources that exist. And I'm calling for an integrative approach, if I could say, that uses those knowledges of those vulnerable populations as an information layer in the decision-making process. And participatory geospatial tools provide that alternative approach. And that is something I've used for several years. And so a multi-scale, multi-stakeholder approach, I think, would be a good platform. And to conclude, I would argue that this second order impact of COVID-19 are going to be experienced differently. I think I already mentioned that. And the impacts are going to be more pronounced in access to and availability of critical infrastructure. And I think this is something Gaston mentioned earlier, access to critical infrastructure such as health, water, education, and credit. And the reason I mentioned credit here is just last year, when I became interested in this, I pulled these two headlines, one in September of 2020 and another one just 3 months ago. And they talk about a liaison group launching pension fund for the informal sector. And the headline this March talks about pioneer targeting formal and informal sector with new retirement plans. And when I saw those headlines, I asked myself, what percent of the informal sector actually has access to this knowledge? And I would not be surprised that only a very small percentage is aware that Liaison Group has launched a pension fund, which is a good thing. And so my question becomes, how do we connect this information to the people? And that is why I'm talking about connecting people and data points and resources. And so impact would be more pronounced, like I said, to the vulnerable populations who may not necessarily have access to information, may not have access to these services, the programs and resources. And so it will require approaches that recognize internal differences, incorporate local experiences within decision-making systems. And so what I think would be a potential area of collaboration for me would be a way of looking at this from a multi-scale perspective, multi-stakeholder perspective, and integrating field-based participatory approaches that incorporate community experiences into geospatial tools. That way, I think we can better understand the informal sector better, recognizing those differences, then identify these populations and connect the populations to information, services, programs, and resources, and mitigate COVID-19 downstream impacts in a socially and spatially differentiated post-pandemic landscape. I'll be very happy to entertain some questions. I'm sure there will be many questions, and thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, Dr. Koti. What wow, what a different direction to go, and a great way to kind of wrap up our discussion on livelihoods here today. I appreciate very much your desire to help us reframe this, to help us kind of break out of perhaps some of the doom and gloom that we discuss when we think of COVID second order impacts, and looking at whether it's real or perceived gains that some of these organizations are making. We have some great questions coming along, but I wanted to insert at least one of my own here today. And you speak to the potential for collaboration and trying to engage with the communities, field-based participatory approaches. So my question includes, do you have, for those in the audience thinking of trying to apply these lessons learned and these insights in their own community, do you have suggestions on key roles within the community, whether it's the municipal government, but most definitely the Department of Economics or the cadastral office that would be great, would be best to connect to? And then second part of that question is, do you have any geospatial tools or visualizations that you plan to use in working with the community and in delivering this data and these insights to decision makers, or best practices you'd share with us on kind of how do you tell this story and help decision makers and the community better understand these issues as you've researched them and make the insights you've made?
I think those are very good questions, Laura. To the first question, whether I have knowledge of who may collaborate and the stakeholders, I think when you think about, when you look at development practice and academic practice and reality on the ground, sometimes there is a disconnect. And so when I talk about a multi-stakeholder approach, I'm looking at people like myself, others who are already working on the field, whether it is in the non-governmental sector, municipalities, and in the case of Kenya, the county governments, and then the actual people on the ground. And to segue into the second question, geographic information systems actually has multiple platforms for incorporating local content, incorporating local stories, incorporating local experiences. And that way, the use of the mobile phone by folks on the ground actually can become a tool that can be used to integrate experiences on the ground.
Thank you very much. We do have a couple questions for you in the Q&A. You speak to the role of local and perhaps national community stakeholders. Question from David Capelli is, how can the WHO, UN, perhaps the US government help address equitable recovery? And then he mentions the informational session on JEDI issues. I'm not familiar with that. I'm not sure if you are, but would you like to speak to the role of international organizations and or other foreign governments that might have a role or opportunity?
I have not worked with international organizations, but my limited involvement, especially with the US Department of State, when I traveled to South Africa, was the possibility of facilitating, creating a framework for collaboration and for building partnerships. Really, the facilitating part is more important because when I traveled to South Africa with the US State Department, I was able to actually create network or build network of African geospatial scientists. And from that point, we were able to pull resources and knowledge together. So not to dismiss that point, but I think these international agencies or other governments can facilitate to bring different stakeholders together.
Thank you. This is also along the lines of international and maybe a bit beyond the scope, but is there a role for China that you see in how they are engaging in African cities and how they might be involved in the post-pandemic informal sector?
And I want to make sure that you say China.
Yes, the country of China.
Yes. That is a different question, because when you look at what is happening, and this is quite anecdotal information, is more of a capital intensive approach as opposed to labor intensive approach. And when I look at Kenya, really, we are a very labor intensive approach. And if I were to invest in anything, will not be highways and bridges. I'll be looking at where this 80% that is producing services is. And so there is a role there, but I would call it a facilitative role as opposed to the capital intensive of building stadiums and highways.
Absolutely. Drilling down a bit further, we've got a question here. If you could elaborate a little bit more on the lockdown strategies and how those might have impacted the resilience of the informal sector.
One aspect of lockdowns is mobility, curtailing mobility, and the informal sector thrives on mobility and personal relationships. And those lockdowns just almost made that impossible. And people that I know personally that were engaged in the informal sector could not thrive because they now did not have the mobility, they did not have the space to engage in their businesses. And so the lockdowns and closures affected the informal sector in much greater depth because of the lack of mobility.
Thank you. And our final question, I think, for today, so we can get to our closing, from Robert Kinlock. He thanks you for a very interesting presentation and was asking if you could comment on what the emerging trends could mean for linkages between the formal and informal sector.
That is a very interesting question of the emerging trends of the formal and informal. One of the things that observations that I have made is that there is a lot of people within the formal sector who actually are key players in the informal sector. And so when we address the informal sector, that is the reason I'm calling for a much more finer scale in understanding the landscape, because some of the players within the informal sector are actually within the formal sector and are playing at a much higher level and don't experience the vulnerabilities that some others have. And so I don't see them as opposed or as competing. They probably could be complementary. And so it is possible that the formal and the informal could actually have synergies.
Thank you so much today, Dr. Koti. With this, I'd like to draw to a close our symposium for today. Gosh, thank you so much. It has really been a tremendous set of insights and eye-opening discussion here that you've had for us, shared with us today. And we really do appreciate your time here, just as we appreciate the time and the presentations from our 3 panelists from earlier, from our 4 lightning talks that we heard from our C2M2 partners. In a brief couple moments of wrapping up and thoughts here today, Dr. Koti, I really appreciated your final line there, because I think it ties together nicely the thread that we've seen that, to understand livelihoods, in particular to understand vulnerable communities and the most impacted by these second order economic impacts on livelihoods and informal sector. We need to do a fine scale of analysis. And really, we've heard so many of our presenters and experts here speak to the importance of local analysis and local scale understanding to inform national, regional, even global activities and understanding of these second order impacts. You also spoke to the importance of the local context and networks of working together that are working together locally and regionally to share best practices that are best suited for the communities in which you're trying to work and to help mitigate these second order impacts. It's such a tremendous undertaking to try and help mitigate economic second order impacts. Dr. Richardson started us off this morning talking about both the double whammy, if you will, of the jobs lost and food prices rising, and bringing it back to geospatial tools and technologies. Our presentations from Ms. Fiquinata and Dr. Gaston talked about the value of defining your question well and creating well-crafted data and analysis to really make a contribution on the ground to these impacts to support the communities and the key stakeholders, and to inform the decision makers so that they can best develop these political and these different ways of trying to reduce the spread of COVID, but at the same time recognizing the importance of the socioeconomic implications that things such as lockdowns and other issues that have arisen here. So really, thank you so much, Dr. Koti, as our keynote here today on livelihoods. You've set us up well for tomorrow, where we'll speak to gender. So many of our conversations have circled around to the fact that all of these second order impacts are very closely connected. I will pass it over to Dr. Lettieri to finish up our comments for today, but thank you all to our presenters. It has really been a great opportunity to learn from you, to share expertise. Thank you everyone to our participants, our attendees, and contributors as well. We've had such great comments going today and such great questions going today. I hope to see you all back here tomorrow and even on Friday for the demo piece of things. Really do appreciate your contribution.